Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can I invite you to come with me on a virtual magic carpet to Edinburgh, to the Advocates Library, which is the home of the Faculty of Advocates in Scotland, the Scots Bar. My name is David Edward. I'm a member of the Faculty of Advocates. I'm a Professor Emeritus of the University of Edinburgh, and I was formerly a judge of the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. I welcome you on behalf of Mr. Roddy Dunlop QC, the Dean of the Faculty of Advocates, and Professor Avram Sher, who is the Chairman of the Hamlyn Trust. And I invite you to the first of the 72nd series of Hamlyn lectures. Just a word about the Hamlyn Trust. It was set up by the trustees of Miss Emma Warburton Hamlyn, who came from an old Devonshire family. Her father was a solicitor in Torquay, and she was born in Torquay and lived in Torquay for the whole of her life. She never married, and she left the residue of her estate to trustees whom she instructed to administer the money in furtherance of lectures to make us aware of our legal heritage. The first lecture was delivered by Lord Denning in 1949, and this year's lecturer is Eleanor Sharpston, whom I've known and admired for many years. I don't care to say how many.
All right.
Eleanor grew up in Brazil, Switzerland, France, and Austria. And of course, she's now multilingual in a frightening number of languages. She spent a brief spell at the Conservatory in Vienna, training and hoping to be a professional musician, but eventually decided to go to King's College, Cambridge, as a classicist, and she studied economics, languages, and law. She also took part in the concerts given by a choir called the King's Voices. From King's Cambridge, she went to Corpus Christi College in Oxford, and there she taught and researched in economics and law, and she also took part in the choir of that college. She was called to the bar of the Middle Temple in 1980 and practiced as a barrister in private practice for 7 years. She then went for 3 years as a judicial assistant to Sir Gordon Slynn, who was then Advocate General and subsequently Judge of the Court of Justice in Luxembourg. She then returned to practice at the English bar in 1990, and she was appointed Queen's Counsel in 1999. She became a bencher of the Middle Temple in 2005. In parallel with her practice at the bar, she was a lecturer in European law and comparative law at University College London. From there, she went to be a fellow of King's Cambridge from 1992 to 2019, and has been an emeritus fellow since 2011. She's an honorary fellow of Corpus Christi College, Oxford, an honorary bencher of King's Inns in Dublin, an honorary fellow of the British Academy, and she holds honorary doctorates from the universities of Glasgow, Nottingham-Trent, Stockholm, and Edinburgh. She has been an Advocate General at the Court of Justice from 2006 to 2020, September. Just to explain the role of the Advocate General, the task of the Advocate General is to present an opinion to the court, analysing the issues in a case and presenting the possible solutions that the judges might adopt. In her time at Luxembourg, she presented over 340 opinions covering many aspects of EU constitutional, substantive and procedural law. Her opinions were highly valued by the court and also by students of EU law, including myself, for their clarity, their comprehensiveness, and skill in selecting and explaining possible solutions. She is a citizen of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg and naturally fluent in Luxembourgish language. She's also, and I think this may be the first time a Hamlyn lecturer has been this, she's a black belt in karate, and she's currently studying Krav Maga, whatever that may be, but I believe it's a sport akin to karate. Not content with that, she plays the viola in the Luxembourg Philharmonia, an amateur orchestra, and you will find some of their playing on YouTube. Tonight, she is going to the first of her lectures under the general title of The Great Experiment, Constructing a European Union under the Rule of Law from a Group of Sovereign States. And this particular lecture, the first in the series, is entitled Competing Claims to Preeminence and the Lessons of History. So I now invite you to hear this lecture.
Sir David, thank you very much indeed for that very kind introduction. Indeed, we have been friends. You've been my mentor and guide for EU law for much longer than either of us cares to remember. And I would like to begin by saying that I am truly sad that I am with you only virtually, because I was looking forward very much to being back in Scotland. I am very proud of the fact that I have honorary doctorates from Glasgow and Edinburgh, and I was hoping to be back in God's own country. I have permitted myself to put my husband's tartan, which is Farquharson, sort of drape it around my neck. Symbolically, I'm meant to be in Edinburgh. Now, people often try to understand EU law by approaching it head-on in the context of a specific problem that's cropped up that has what they will call a European angle. Frequently, they've had little or no previous exposure to the topic, and usually this encounter takes place with a nasty deadline looming. And the result is depressing and unsatisfactory. EU law feels strange, unfamiliar, illogical. Why cannot it just follow the ordinary, decent, natural rules of the legal system with which I'm familiar? Why not simply scrutinize the text carefully, applying tried and tested principles of statutory interpretation, hallowed by centuries of reverential use? Why this emphasis on preambles and recitals, on teleology? Why this strident insistence that EU law must take precedence over national law if the two collide? and that many of its key principles can be relied upon directly by an individual against the authorities of the member state in which he lives. Why this bizarre and sometimes fungible frontier between what is laid down as uniform requirements applicable throughout the European Union and what is left to national law to regulate and resolve? And as for the judgments of the Court of Justice of the European Union, which is usually referred to rather inaccurately in the Anglo-Saxon world as the ECJ, but I'm going to be fussy because I work there, and call it by its correct acronym, the CJU. Well, as for its judgments, where outside Bedlam would you think that writing a judgment using clumsy set phrases that resemble nothing so much as Lego building blocks was a sensible way for a Supreme Court to communicate and engage with its readers? Now, in these 3 lectures, I want to take you with me on a voyage of exploration, as interesting and challenging in its way as the great seafaring voyages that led to the discovery of the New World with all its unfamiliarity and exotica and riches. It is a journey that has intrigued me, indeed that has enchanted and mesmerized me as an academic and practitioner. I want to try to take us together into the inside of an utterly extraordinary legal experiment that has been running in parallel with a big economic and political experiment for nearly 70 years, ever since the first of the European communities, the European Coal and Steel Community, came into being. The process will require us to begin by taking a selective tour through the historical European legal landscape, so that we understand where the founding fathers, Robert Schuman, Jean Monnet, Konrad Adenauer, and Alcide de Gasperi, were starting from, and the extent of the challenge that lay before them. That challenge was assuredly economic and political, but it was also historical, social, and technical. Technical in this sense being legal. You see, law is woven into the very fabric of society. Our national legal systems are not just a set of dry rules that happen to be enforced at a particular moment in time. They reflect our value systems, where we strike the balance between competing interests within society, what we regard as obvious and automatic, and what we require to be demonstrated with meticulous proof. Putting together a brand new supranational legal system that at the same time functions as an integrated part of each individual and different national legal system has taken years of careful and incremental labour, and it is a work in progress. EU law, like national law, is fashioned by imperfect and fallible human beings, be they the Council and the European Parliament co-legislating, Commission draftsmen, judges, or advocates general. The resulting patchwork quilt of texts and their interpretation has its share of false stitches, of inaccurate joins, and lumpy seams. There have been moments wrestling with a particularly intractable problem of EU legislative interpretation and unhelpfully opaque and seemingly contradictory lines of CJEU case law, when I have muttered to myself, this is such a pig's ear of a mess. And then have gone on a little ruefully to add, I suppose the amazing thing is not that there are bits that don't work very well, it's that the system works at all. And actually, it mainly does work. I shall leave you to decide at the end of these 3 lectures which judgment is the fairer. So, let us begin at the beginning. by tracing with rather broad brushstrokes the development of European legal history. Now, I cannot possibly do the topic justice orally in part of a single lecture, so I will ask the indulgence of those whose speciality is comparative legal history for the gross oversimplification that must necessarily follow. I suppose we could with advantage start with the Romans, with the law that followed conquest and that was an essential feature of the Pax Romana. Civilization and peace and order, of course, implied common rules. Now, I'm not speaking here of the jus quiritium, the early jus civilis, which applied only to Roman citizens, not to disputes between Roman citizens and foreigners. I'm speaking of the workaday Roman law current in the provinces under Rome's authority. The new rules were initially imposed as the consequence of successful military force. They stayed and gained acceptance and retained acceptance because on the whole they worked. Then there was Justinian's great codification, which, having faded a little from sight in the turmoil that was the Dark Ages, was rediscovered, studied anew, and very broadly reapplied in large parts of continental Europe from about the 11th century onwards. Time does not permit me, you may think fortunately, to indulge myself in this lecture by tracing the various subsequent trends in exorbitant detail. We can all pick out our favourite moments from the very rich tapestry that is European legal history. Personally, I have a particular fondness for the Hanseatic League, the organisation founded by North German towns and communities of their merchants overseas to protect their trading interests, which successfully dominated commercial activity in the Baltic and surrounding areas from the 13th to the 15th century. And as early as 1210, Lübeck and Hamburg, two of the Hanse towns, agreed that a common law should apply between them in certain matters. Elsewhere, important market towns rejoiced at being given royal or princely or ducal charters, since with the charter came valuable legal privileges. In many, many places, trades and professions were self-regulated by professional guilds, with their elaborate hierarchies and rules, which served the twin purposes of safeguarding monopoly power and affording some degree of consumer protection. In short, law was inextricably intertwined with the successful exercise of economic power. And so my whirlwind tour continues via the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 and the beginning of the rise of the nation state, and on through the Enlightenment. Sometimes it's difficult to tell whether what is happening is yet greater fragmentation, or whether underneath the apparent proliferation of different systems, some kind of a trend is emerging towards greater uniformity. Thus, as Professor Stein has put it, from the middle of the 17th until the end of the 18th century, the laws of the states of continental Europe were subject to two contrasting movements. On the one hand, there was a tendency to emphasize national differences and to move towards specifically national laws, so that Romano-German law became German law when it was not even more narrowly identified as Bavarian law or Saxon law. On the other hand, there was a tendency, particularly among academic commentators, to stress the common elements of the different systems and to point out that although national forensic practices had moved away from Justinian's law in significant respects, they were moving more or less in the same direction. Then, of course, we get the codification of private law. Much though one may dislike the expansionist military ambitions of Napoleon Bonaparte, it's difficult not to admire the sheer energy and dynamism of a man who kept a close and watchful eye on the evolution of the Code Napoleon whilst he was out on campaign winning battle after battle. In due course, within the civilian tradition, there emerged broadly two models for private law. The Code civil des Français, which was effective 21st of March 1804, and the Bürgerliches Gesetzbuch, which started its development in about 1881 and became effective on the 1st of January 1900. In the meantime, public and administrative law develop in parallel, and that's often indeed under completely different court systems. And so, European history moves forward through the centuries, individual secular powers waxed and waned, and individual national legal systems develop their own distinctive features and quirks. For almost any question you care to ask, you will be able to find disparate answers. Are laymen, as well as professional lawyers, involved in the administration of the criminal justice system? And if so, what do they do and when? Is administrative law handled under different rules from private and criminal law, under a separate system of courts? And if so, precisely how does that work? Do we have one or two or numerous supreme courts? Is there a separate constitutional court? What is the interrelationship between the Supreme Court or courts and the Constitutional Court, if there is one? Do cases sometimes transfer across between them under some mechanism? And if so, at whose behest? To what extent are there separate specialist codes and courts to deal with sub-areas of law, such as commercial law, or labour law, or tax law, to name but three? And all that is before we start to delve into land law, or family law, or succession, and discover substrata, parts of law that are so entwined with social structures that they sometimes reflect much older patterns and values than the more modern commercial or mercantile law. Now, there is, of course, an excellent example of a single state with two very distinct legal systems close to home, or perhaps I should say closer to where this lecture was intended to be delivered. Since the Act of Union between Scotland and England in 1707, Scotland has continued to have its own separate legal system. Ask any self-respecting Scots lawyer, and he will point to the advantages that Scots law enjoys over its cousin south of the border. Let me, very diffidently, as befits a mere fellow Celt and a Scot by marriage, let me offer a couple of illustrations. The first is a painfully obvious one. Were I ever to be unfortunate enough to face criminal charges, I would certainly prefer to be tried in a system where the jury can choose between three verdicts, guilty, not guilty, and not proven, rather than just the two available to it in England. The second illustration provided one of the few mildly amusing moments at the CJEU in relation to Brexit. The reference for a preliminary ruling in Whiteman and others came from the inner house of the Court of Session. In its written observations to the court and later in oral argument, the United Kingdom didn't go anywhere near the substance of the reference. It confined itself to arguing that the reference was inadmissible, taking, if I may say so, a view of national procedural rules that was distinctly tinged by English law. I think it could perhaps be summarized, perhaps a little crudely, as because you wouldn't be able to run this action under the rules of English judicial review, the reference therefore must be inadmissible. However, the referring court had stated in terms that it was neither academic nor premature to ask the Court of Justice whether it was legally possible for a member state to revoke unilaterally the notification made under Article 50, Para 2 TEU and to remain in the European Union. The reference was made under Scots law, not under English law. I am delighted to record that the Court of Justice, applying well-established principles, accepted what the referring national court, the Scots Court, said about Scots law and declared the reference to be admissible. My colleague, Advocate General Campos Sanchez-Bordona, was particularly emphatic in his opinion, and I quote, "The court must assume that the referring court has adopted the order for reference in accordance with the rules governing procedure, jurisdiction, and judicial organization in force in its national law. Specifically, it is not appropriate now to question whether the procedural mechanism of judicial review as applied in Scotland permits in this individual case, as in other cases already decided by the court, both the reference for a preliminary ruling and the subsequent decision of the court making the reference." So let me try to summarize where we've got to so far. From classical times onwards, trade has followed the flag, law, or at least the influence of a particular legal system, has followed in their wake, imposed sometimes by consent, often by force. In other words, law follows the exercise of power. However, the impact of new law is not uniform. The law of commercial relations is usually dictated by commercial power, whereas odd corners of private law or land tenure may cling stubbornly and successfully to previous socio-legal patterns and thinking. As a result, by the early 20th century, the Europe of the nation states had become a patchwork quilt of different legal systems. Fortunately for my story, the laws of the original 6 member states that got together to found the various European communities, whilst far from uniform, did have a number of clear continental traits in common. This is maybe also the moment to say that individual legal systems have their strengths and their blind spots. Sometimes they merely represent different ways of getting to approximately the same place. Does it really matter whether you must have consideration, even if it is merely token, for a valid contract to come into existence, rather than needing to adhere to a particular set of formalities laid down in a code? Providing you know whether or not you're establishing formal legal relations, actually that's probably good enough. Moreover, the influence of any particular system has waxed and waned with the power exercised by its sponsor. And also imitation of other people's good ideas has always had its part to play. Now, at this moment, I need to have a slight dislocation in the historical narrative because we need to pause and we need to glance forward. We're going to have to bear in mind later in this story that the sequential accessions to the EEC and then the EC and then the EU have added further colours to the palette. Denmark joined the European communities in the same year, 1973, as the United Kingdom and Ireland. Thus, at the same moment as the common law tradition entered the mix, so too did the first Scandinavian legal system. 3 member states joined as they got rid of their right-wing dictatorships, EEC membership being seen as a badge of having re-embraced democracy. Those were Greece in 1981, followed by Spain and Portugal, both in 1986. And then we have further Scandinavian systems that followed Denmark into the club, with the accession of both Sweden and Finland in 1995. By the way, that was the year in which Austria, with its civilian system, which is close to but not identical to the German system, also joined the EC. The member states that acceded to the European Union after the fall of communism, in the major wave of accessions in 2004, added enormous further diversity to the mixture. You have the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Then you have the former Soviet states, Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia, often grouped together under the banner Central and Eastern European, but in reality, each manifesting a different set of choices as to what to resurrect from pre-Soviet days, what to maintain, and what to borrow from where in order to adapt their legal structures to a new free market economy. And into this latter group, we should put from two subsequent accessions, Bulgaria and Romania, who joined in 2007, and Croatia, which joined in 2013. And then just to add a little Mediterranean spice to the mixture, there are Cyprus and Malta, which joined as part of the 2004 accession. Both those member states offer wonderful illustrations of what I've been trying to convey to you about the historical reasons why legal systems within the European Union are so diverse. Thus, in Cyprus, British colonial rule between 1878 and 1960 has meant, as Nikitas Hatzimirchal puts it, that private law in most subjects and criminal law follow the English common law, whereas public law has a continental orientation. Ironically, almost all subjects are covered by comprehensive legislative instruments. Colonial era codifications of the common law, transplants of English statutes, but also transplants of Greek law in continental enclaves. Procedural law is purely common law, a major factor in the mutation of the continental elements of the legal system. And then if we look at Malta, well, for many centuries, the legal system in Malta, as in the greater part of continental Europe, was based on Justinian's codification of Roman law, as rediscovered and developed from medieval times onwards. Under the Knights of Malta, the Order of St. John, we get the Maritime Code of the Consolato del Mare, adopted in 1697, and also the 1784 Code de Rouen, and they further adapted Maltese Roman law to the particular circumstances of Malta. Then we have the French invasion in 1798, and with it, of course, a major revolution in Maltese law and society. However, the new French system doesn't get very long to put down roots, because the Maltese rebelled against the French and they invited the British in to help them in that struggle. And then the British stayed on. As David Joseph Attard and his colleagues Kevin Aquilina and Patricia Malia explain, initially, the British only altered laws relating to the safety and defence of Malta. They left the rest of Maltese Roman law relatively untouched. Gradually, however, they introduced more and more familiar, proper, British ways of doing things. Straightforward common law implants, such as trial by jury, the rules of evidence, the organisation of the Maltese court system. The hybrid legal system that evolved still belongs to the civil law continental family, but has absorbed many features of the common law tradition. Thus, for example, the substantive rules on theft in the Maltese Criminal Code are essentially continental, but the suspected thief will be tried within a recognisably common law criminal court structure with common law rules and procedures. Let's now go back to the whirlwind tour, pick up the story where I left it, which was at the end of the 19th century. And I'm going to make an obvious, I fear almost a trite statement about European history as such. The statement being that whoever was top dog at any given moment, there were sure to be others who were snapping at their heels. Preeminence begets rivalry as well as emulation. Alongside struggles for self-determination and independence, contention for economic dominance all too readily morphed into open conflict. The first half of the 20th century was marked, I should rather say, was deeply scarred by those two cataclysmic events that we call the world wars, because other nations across the planet became involved in what started off as yet another European quarrel between competing neighbours. I wonder if others sense the irony of holding solemn events to mark the 100th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme, which started on the 1st of July 1916, a bare week after the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom. The irony is particularly acute because the Battle of the Somme was launched, in part, to take the pressure off the French forces at Verdun. Verdun being the iconic battle of that war for French and Germans alike. For all its carnage, the Great War, as World War I was also called, failed to be the war to end all wars. It was instead followed by severe economic depression that spawned more nationalism and isolation. Civilized nations with apparently well-developed legal systems proved vulnerable to toxic populism and totalitarianism and were unable to check gross violations of the most basic rights. There followed a second cataclysm, World War II, which left the continent of Europe shattered and in ruins. Looking back from the peace, prosperity, and yes, security of our 21st century European society, it is hard to conceive of the sheer scale of the devastation. There was, of course, the physical damage to the economies of all the European countries concerned. What a bland statement. Translated, that meant columns of weary refugees and displaced persons, real hunger, real poverty, real jeopardy to people's livelihoods. There was also the immense moral damage, as exemplified by the concentration or extermination camps, which had eliminated undesirables of every kind: homosexuals, Roma, political opponents, the disabled, and where 6 million Jewish lives were snuffed out in the Shoah. The rebuilding project did not merely require bricks and mortar. It called for a new vision of how to run economies and bring together legal systems so as to promote prosperity and safeguard fundamental rights. Winston Churchill recognized as much in a speech given at Zurich University on the 19th of September 1946, thus a little over a year after the war had ended. We've heard so much, faux Churchillian rhetoric, both about Brexit and about the coronavirus crisis from the current UK Prime Minister, that I hope you will allow me to remind you what the genuine article sounds like. Churchill spoke first in glowing terms of what Europe could and should be. Europe is the origin of most of the culture, arts, philosophy, and science, both of ancient and modern times. If Europe were once again united in the sharing of its common inheritance, there would be no limit to the happiness, the prosperity, and the glory which its 300 million or 400 million people would enjoy. And then he passed on almost immediately to describe the plight to which Europe has been reduced. I quote, "Some of the smaller states have indeed made a good recovery, but over wide areas are a vast quivering mass of tormented, hungry, careworn, and bewildered human beings who wait at the ruins of their cities and their homes and scan the horizons for the approach of some new form of tyranny or terror. Amongst the victors, there is a ballet of voices. Amongst the vanquished, the sullen silence of despair. That is all that Europeans, grouped in so many ancient states and nations, and that is all the Germanic nations have got by tearing each other to pieces and spreading havoc far and wide. And Churchill then described what he called the sovereign remedy, which needed to be adopted, which was to recreate the European fabric, or as much of it as we can, and to provide it with a structure under which it can dwell in peace, in safety and in freedom. We must build a kind of United States of Europe. In this way only will hundreds of millions of toilers be able to regain the simple joys and hopes which make life worth living. And then the passage which, looking back over the intervening 74 years, still takes me aback by its boldness, its prescience, and its generosity of spirit. I am now going to say something that will astonish you. The first step in the recreation of the European family must be a partnership between France and Germany. In this way only can France recover the moral and cultural leadership of Europe. There can be no revival of Europe without a spiritually great France and a spiritually great Germany. The structure of the United States of Europe will be such as to make the material strength of a single state less important. Small nations will count as much as large ones and gain their honor by a contribution to the common cause. The ancient states and principalities of Germany, freely joined for mutual convenience in a federal system, might take their individual places among the United States of Europe. Now, it is only right to add that Churchill did not envisage the United Kingdom participating in this enterprise, on the basis, as he put it, that we British have our own Commonwealth of Nations. A statement that at the time it was made was unquestionably true and probably valid enough. Churchill concluded his speech with a great rallying cry, "Therefore I say to you, let Europe arise." Over the next few years, the continental Europeans were not idle. Again, time does not permit me to trace in full here the initiatives and the rebuffs. Let me jump forward to the next major milestone, the Schuman Declaration of 9th May 1950. In it, the French Foreign Minister, Robert Schuman, I am intensely proud to say a Luxembourger by birth, proposed the creation of a European coal and steel community, whose members would pool their production of those two materials. The Schuman Declaration should be compulsory reading for anyone who opens their mouth to talk about the European project. It begins with words that immediately place it in its historical context. World peace cannot be safeguarded without the making of creative efforts proportionate to the dangers which threaten it. The contribution which an organized and living Europe can bring to civilization is indispensable to the maintenance of peaceful relations. A united Europe was not achieved, and we had war. Intensely pragmatic, the Schuman Declaration recognizes that Europe will not be made all at once or according to a single plan. It will be built through concrete achievements which first create a de facto solidarity. The coming together of the nations of Europe requires the elimination of the age-old opposition of France and Germany. Any action taken must in the first place concern these two countries. And the declaration then proposes that Franco-German production of coal and steel as a whole be placed under a common high authority within the framework of an organization open to the participation of the other countries of Europe. This is a statement about economics and about technology. If you put the sinews of war, coal and steel, under shared control, then nation shall not lift up sword against nation. Or, in the only slightly less biblical and more prosaic words of the Declaration, the solidarity in production thus established will make it plain that any war between France and Germany becomes not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. The Schuman Declaration was followed in 1952 by the first of the three treaties establishing the individual European communities, the European Coal and Steel Community, the ECSC Treaty. Now, English-trained lawyers and politicians alike tend not to read preambles, on the basis, presumably, that since they are not substantive provisions, they don't really matter. That is, I venture to say, a dangerous habit where EU law is concerned. Here is the preamble of the ECSC Treaty. Listen to the real passion behind the legal phrases. The draftsmen are considering that world peace can be safeguarded only by creative efforts commensurate with the dangers that threaten it. They're convinced that the contribution which an organized and vital Europe can make to civilization is indispensable to the maintenance of peaceful relations. Then they speak of practical achievements which will create real solidarity. And then they say that they are resolved to substitute for age-old rivalries the merging of their essential interests, to create, by establishing an economic community, the basis for a broader and deeper community among peoples long divided by bloody conflicts, and to lay the foundations for institutions which will give direction to a destiny henceforward shared. The substantive provisions of the ECSC Treaty then put in place a common market, common objectives, and common institutions. If you look at that text with eyes used to reading the EEC and EC treaties and now the TFEU, it is easy enough to detect the precursors of ideas, principles, and mechanisms that were then later developed and further refined for main EU law. In that sense, the ECSC Treaty was an early testing ground for what happened later. The ECSC Treaty was followed in 1957 by two further treaties establishing two additional European communities: the Atomic Energy Community, Euratom, and its much more famous brother, the European Economic Community Treaty, the EEC Treaty. I want to conclude this lecture by looking very briefly at the contents of that treaty to see what the draftsman gave us. Try, if you will, with me, to imagine that treaty as it was in 1957, freshly typed, freshly signed, without knowing how it would subsequently be shaped by the efforts of enterprising litigators and the decisions of the court. The preamble to the EEC Treaty unashamedly sets out that treaty's objectives. The first three recitals explained without ambiguity that the signatories were determined to lay the foundations of an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe, and were resolved to ensure the economic and social progress of their countries by common action to eliminate the barriers which divide Europe. The essential objective of their efforts being the constant improvement of the living and working conditions of their people. Succeeding recitals then sketched out the main elements in the programme, and the final recital is a clarion call to visionary action. The signatories declare that they are, I quote, resolved by thus pooling their resources to preserve and strengthen peace and liberty, and they call upon the other peoples of Europe who share their ideal to join in their efforts. With the greatest possible respect to those who read the EEC Treaty otherwise, I do not think that the intention was ever just to create a simple free trade area which would afford enhanced opportunities for increased sales of widgets in a wider geographical market. The substantive provisions of the EEC Treaty, written in a drafting style that seems to me to be a cross between international law and French administrative law style, duly delivered on that programme. After some statements about tasks, activities and general principles, such as loyal cooperation and non-discrimination, Title I dealt with tariff and non-tariff barriers to free movement of goods. Agricultural support was vital to at least one signatory, France, and probably much appreciated by certain others, Italy for sure, Luxembourg probably. So that obviously got included as Title II, the Common Agricultural Policy, which has been an important and indeed controversial aspect of EU law ever since. Title III contains sections laying down the principles, subject to certain reservations, of free movement of persons, free movement of workers, freedom of establishment, also freedom to provide services, and free movement of capital. Then a common transport policy is established. Then in Title V, there are rules requiring both private and public actors to respect fair competition, rules on internal taxation, and a mechanism for the approximation of such laws, regulations, or administrative provisions of the member states as directly affect the establishment or functioning of the common market. So these provisions complemented the earlier measures so as to create a single economic market as free as possible from deliberate distortions. There was an initial framework, perhaps a little skeletal, for economic and monetary policy. There were provisions on external trade and common commercial policy, social policy, education, vocational training, equal pay, treatment of the overseas countries and territories. Remember that the original 6 member states included former colonial powers. All of this already got a mention. This was already an enormous and very ambitious project. Importantly, the treaty draftsman foresaw that there would be a need for what I shall loosely call secondary legislation. So they duly equipped the new community with a set of instruments for achieving its goals, both legally binding measures, directives, regulations, and decisions, and some soft law tools, recommendations, and opinions. Then there are the institutions with their distinct legislative, executive, and supervisory functions. An assembly, which later became a directly elected European Parliament, a council, a commission, a court of auditors. And amongst these institutions, the EEC Treaty also set up a court of justice, which was given a simple, yet eloquent, mission statement. The duty to, I quote, ensure that the law is observed. Various procedural routes led to the court. The treaty draftsman envisaged enforcement actions by the Commission as the guardian of the treaties. The occasional spat, perhaps, between member states. Actions by individuals who were the addressee of particular measures or directly and individually concerned by them. Actions for failure to act, actions for damages. Most tellingly, a procedure was put in place enabling national courts, uncertain as to the interpretation of the new law or the validity of instruments of secondary law, to make references for preliminary rulings so as to seek authoritative guidance. And so there we have it, the toolkit for a new start. But here's the point. In the story that I have told you up to this moment, law has been allied to power, be that power military, economic, or political. It has essentially buttressed and reinforced the status quo represented by that power. Now we have a completely different situation. The rather elaborate law that the founding fathers have written, the treaties, has been put in place not to reflect power, but to create something new out of weakness, out of nothing. The great experiment is about to begin. And that's the end of the first lecture. Thank you very much.
Well, Eleanor, can I thank you on behalf of all of us for what has been a wonderfully lively journey on our magic carpet across the extraordinarily diverse landscape of the law in Europe. It's been really fascinating and enlivening and encouraging, if I may say so. You've also told us how we came together to create a new legal system in the European Union without depriving us of the native characteristics of our own legal systems. I think also you have shown us the truth of what was said by a very great Scottish judge, that no one can be a good lawyer who has no sense of history. I think that is most fundamental, and now I have to substitute these remarks for the big round of applause that would certainly have greeted your lecture had it been delivered in person. So now we come to questions, and there's not many brought up yet from the audience, but let me begin with the big question about the understanding of the European project, if I may say so, as a political project and not simply a project for enhancing and facilitating the trade in widgets, as you put it. Do you think that the idea that this, at that time, community would be not just a commercial, but a political union, do you think that that was well understood by the member states when they entered into this at first in 1957? And was it fully understood by the United Kingdom when we joined in 1973?
I think it was understood by the founding fathers that whatever you did, you had to do better than what had just happened. And, you know, if the previous model was nationalistic, sovereign member states competing against each other, the result lay around for everyone to see. But I would go back to the pragmatism of Robert Schuman. You know, he wasn't trying to put everything together in one go in the Schuman Declaration. He was saying, let's just do some small part of the story. Let's put coal and steel under common authority. Now, doing that is not in itself a political statement, it's an economic statement, and it has consequences in terms of production quotas and so on. And it helps to organize a market, so that's very economic. At the same time, it does unquestionably make it unthinkable that there's going to be another war between France and Germany. Unthinkable and also materially impossible. Because I think, you see, I think if I wasn't there, right? But I think that those who were putting the project together didn't see law and society and politics and economics as all living in little different pigeonholes. I think they understood that everything interacts, and what they needed to do was to find some way of getting the European economies back on their feet with the generous aid, of course, of the Marshall Plan money that was going in from the US, but they needed to find a way of rebuilding which didn't replicate the earlier model which Europe knew century after century. Let me see if I can do better, and I will do better by dint of suppressing you, my neighbor. So I think that they saw it, I think they saw it together. Probably nobody, if you had asked the draftsman of the original treaty, would you expect the Court of Justice now in 2020 to have an urgent procedure for dealing with questions involving child abduction between member states? They would probably have looked at you and rubbed their eyes. I don't think anyone had a crystal ball that was so beautifully polished that they knew where this project was going. And indeed, I hope to show that some of the developments were necessary developments, even if you thought and continued to believe that member state sovereignty was intrinsically desirable and important. But you know, this has been an evolving project. This has been a great experiment. That's of course why it's such fun to try and work in it and to study it and to take it forward. And as for what was known in 1973, I have always wondered whether people's understanding of what was going on was colored by the fact that the only series of law reports available in English that gave you the decisions of the ECJ, of the Court of Justice, were called the Common Market Law Reports. In French, it's called the recueil, it's called the collection of the judgments. And the English title for that then became the European Court Reports. But actually, at the time, the European Court Reports before accession didn't exist in English, and the case law was reported in the Common Market Law Reports. And if you speak of a common market, I'm not sure that that gives you the same feeling, the same understanding as reading those texts, the preambles that I have been quoting this evening. Now, the texts were available, the texts existed, you could read them, but I do not know whether people actually began the story where I began it, and whether they looked at the Schuman Declaration, then they looked at the Coal and Steel Treaty preamble, then they looked at the EEC Treaty preamble. Had they done that, and had they read those words with, you know, impartial, open eyes, I think it is difficult to miss that there is a bigger idea behind the project than just having the European Free Trade Area. But I don't know how it was read. I do remember as a student getting out on the streets in Cambridge. I was in my second year in university at the moment when we had the 1975 referendum, and people were being asked to decide whether they wanted to stay in or go out. But how many people actually then read what were the basic texts? I don't know.
Right. Now, that's very interesting. Thank you. Can I then move to a different kind of more legal question? And maybe you're coming to this in later lectures. But the real question is how does the European Union, and most particularly the European Court of Justice, the Court of Justice of the Union, go about reconciling the need to create a system of European Union law without trenching too deeply on the native laws of the member states? Is there a magic secret by which the two can be reconciled?
I'm not sure there's a magic secret. This is indeed what I try to explore in my second lecture. I think the starting point is to look at the toolkit. The toolkit that you're given under the treaty has got different types of instruments. And by the way, the treaty also tells you in various places which type of instrument you can use to legislate in order to run the markets in agriculture, in order to facilitate freedom of establishment. Where you're talking about running a market, for example, the natural tool is a regulation. And a regulation, you set down a single set of prescriptive rules, and there isn't scope for doing things differently in different member states. And you don't implement a regulation, they're directly applicable. Having said that, if you take something like the Common Agricultural Policy, there is always a moment when the EU regulations, as it were, run out. You have a council regulation as a framework regulation, basic regulation in the market. Then you have implementing commission regulations. But at a certain moment, a farmer has got to get a permit, and probably you have a statutory instrument which lays down the detailed rules as to how he gets the permit. So you've got a join there between national law and EU law. But most of the job of the task of the Court of Justice, where you're looking at a regulation, isn't in fact anything that's going to tread on the toes of a member state. It's much more likely to be trying to understand how to interpret the regulation as a piece of EU law. And there sometimes you get problems that arise because EU law is multilingual and because you have texts that are equally authentic in all languages, except that they don't seem to say the same thing in all languages. And I have illustrations of that. Move across from that to a totally different type of instrument, a directive. A directive specifies, we hope with clarity and precision, what the objective is. And some of its articles may be sufficiently precise and clear and unconditional, to use the hallowed formula, that in fact they may be capable of being relied upon against the state. But the rest of the directive leaves the member state space to implement within the national legal system the aims, the objectives, the rights that are there to be conferred. All of that implementation process happens within national law. Then you get different issues for the court to have to deal with. You get, first of all, have we actually understood what the directive was about? Do we have a shared view of exactly what we were doing? And that takes you across into how the legislative process works. And the fact that very often member states turn up in Brussels, everyone carrying in their briefcase a different set of red lines. And the legislative process has to find a way of reconciling that. And then you have the question, assuming we do know what this is meant to mean, does the implementation in fact work? Well, there it depends a little bit on what you're looking at. Are you looking at a reference? Are you looking at an infringement procedure where the court is looking into the national law and saying whether the member state has complied with its objectives and its obligations? Or do you have a reference from a national court where the answer will have to come back in the form, Article 17 of directive, whatever it is to be interpreted as, and then it's either as allowing or as prohibiting. So, I mean, the experiment is also context specific, and the degree to which the EU law quotes intrudes, close quotes, on national law is very dependent on what type of a measure we're talking about and what was the necessary interpretive function that the court was asked to perform. I think I'd add two more points to that. One is that the court actually depends on member states turning up and flagging up in advance of its judgment, that is, during the course of the procedure, whether there will be a particular problem if a particular interpretation is taken. Member states have the right to intervene as of right in all the reference procedures. Sometimes they don't turn up, and then the court makes a decision, and then afterwards there is a problem that is discovered, and people say, look at what the court has done, but perhaps they should also say it's a pity that the member state wasn't there explaining to the court that if it was to go down that particular road, there would be a difficulty. There is the other illustration is to say that during the actual legislative process, if there is going to be a major problem, then it really is incumbent on the member state for whom there will be a major problem to flag that up during the legislative process. And that I want to talk in the next lecture about the Maloney case, where there was a problem under Spanish constitutional law because of the way that the amended version of the European arrest warrant framework decision was phrased. But I mean, there wasn't a problem under the original version. But when the amendment came in, the problem under Spanish constitutional law was not flagged up. And it only came to light when the reference came and went to the Grand Chamber of the Court in Maloney. At which stage the answer was, but you agreed this as a piece of legislation. That was a very long answer to your short question, but perhaps it gives a bit of a flavour. There isn't a baguette magique. I wish there were, but there are parts of the story which it is possible to explain.
It's very kind. Well, we'll look forward to hearing it in the next two lectures. Can I now really, to wind up, but ask you a question posed by the Dean of the Faculty of Advocates? Before doing so, just let me mention a comment by Judge Ian Forrester, who says, I canvassed for votes in the 1975 referendum in Tain, Dingwall, Perth, Stirling, and other places. There was a high attendance, especially by older folk, and many questions about the war and reconciliation or separateness. So that is an illustration from somebody who was involved in the 1975 referendum. Can I now put the question raised by the Dean of the Faculty of Advocates, which comes right up to date, and your reference to the dangers of populism. In the last few weeks, we've had government ministers attacking lefty activist lawyers, and the government has appointed a committee under Lord Fawkes, which appears to envisage a restriction of the ability of the citizen to challenge the state, and also to diminish the reputation of those who cases. You think about that?
Well, as somebody who was very proud to be a member of the practicing bar for 25 years before I went to the court as an Advocate General, I think nothing of it at all. And I would have been one of the 800 lawyers who'd signed the letter calling on the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary to stop making remarks like that when professional lawyers are complying with their professional obligations to act fearlessly in the best interests of their client within the law. And within the law implies, within the legal framework, using the tools that are there in order best to defend the interests of your client. I mean, I would also very respectfully add, we don't need law and we don't need rights to protect the people we like. We usually need them to protect the people we don't like so much. You know, if you look at provisions of whether it's the ECHR or the Charter, or it's domestic constitutional law in the Grundgesetz, the measures that are put there are there to safeguard the rule of law as a framework within which society can enjoy an ordered and a peaceful life. And that includes checks and balances, and it includes the right of citizens within what has grown up as judicial review to make sure that decisions that are taken according to the rules, to make sure that Parliament doesn't get prorogued for 5 weeks at a very convenient moment, but without apparent good excuse. You know, the cases are there in the jurisprudence of the UK Supreme Court, and the cases are there also in the jurisprudence of the Court of Justice of the European Union. The cases on judicial independence, Commission and Poland. You know, Commission and Poland in that context, the two Miller cases, or Miller and I should call it by its proper, you shouldn't just call it Miller 1 and Miller 2. Those are principles of the rule of law. And to me, they are extremely important principles. And I would also say that in a time when, you know, populism is on the rise, I'm going to quote the old poster from World War II, careless talk costs lives. It is not responsible to score political sound bites in a world in which, unfortunately, sometimes people take the political soundbite and then take it much further than the politician ever intended that it should be taken, and something really bad and violent happens. So that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. Before turning over to Professor Avram Sher for a vote of thanks, can I just mention, for the benefit of the audience, something that I was reminded of, which I did not include in my introduction, but it may be of interest, that when you were at Oxford, you were not only a member of the Corpus Christi rowing boat, but you were also, for 2 years running, one of the oars women in the University Women's Boat Club, and you were president of that club for 2 years running. It just illustrates the width of your achievements, and thought it might be amusing for people to know that. Now I pass over to Professor Sher for a vote.
Thank you, and I'm going to thank first of all Ms. Hamlyn for her beneficence, which has brought us all here. I'm going to thank Cambridge University Press, who have supported publication of the Hamlyn books up until today. I'm going to thank Dean Roddy Dunlop and the Faculty of Advocates in Edinburgh for hosting and for superb technical support, especially All Considered. And if I may, I'm going to thank fellow trustees for choosing such an excellent lecturer, and especially Joshua Rosenberg for practical assistance to both Eleanor and myself. And Sir David, may I thank you for a terrific introduction and for perfect sharing. Thank you also to our wonderful audience from all around the globe. I presume that we will soon hear and feel your views. But most of all, of course, Eleanor, to our indomitable, unfazed lecturer in these supremely difficult times. You started our historical journey with what did the Romans do for Europe? And you moved swiftly on through Dark Ages and the Hanseatic League and onto Napoleonic conquests and right up to the genesis of European law with that excellent analytical comparison that this system of law was born out of weakness, the devastation of Europe through the desire for peace and harmony, those wonderful Churchillian terms, the sullen silence of despair, and how everyone had torn each other to pieces. And this system was there rather than being imposed by power or commercial advantage. it came out of the desire to work together. So at this point, with this naissance of Europe just in front of us, we're left eager for the next 2 lectures on the edge of our seats, and also the rest of the story. I can hear behind me just about the beginnings of Ode to Joy, the European anthem, as it's going to play us out this evening. But in the foreground, I sense our audience rising from their seats across the globe and beginning a rapturous applause. It will be more like a myriad of butterfly wings, which hopefully will, through the atmosphere, make their way through to you, Eleanor, in Luxembourg. Thank you for a wonderful lecture. Thank you, everybody, for being with us tonight, and good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.